So good morning, I'm Amanda Purcell. I'm the Associate Director of Climate Crossroads at the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine in Washington, D.C. It's great to join you all for this session, Climate Conversations, Science Policy Crossroads. This discussion today is part of a National Academy's Climate Conversations Pathways to Action series, which we are hosting here at the Greater Baltimore Climate Summit. We're grateful to Carrie Harris and the organizers for letting us be a part of their program this year. So this discussion today will explore the intersection of science and policymaking, how evidence can best inform decisions on public issues from local to national scales. Our conversation will feature two experts whose work sits at this intersection of science, policy, and community impact. Dr. Ben Zaitchik, professor at Johns Hopkins University and president-elect of the American Geophysical Union, and Lauren Wustenberg, founder of Fork Legal Design and former counsel to the U.S. Senate Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry. So we'll have, So we'll have about 30 minutes of conversation between our speakers today, and then we'll be opening up the floor for about 10 to 15 minutes of audience Q&A. And I'll just note that today's conversation is also being live streamed and recorded on the National Academy's event webpage, and so for all of the folks who are joining us online there, we invite you to put your questions in the Slido Q&A box just below the video, and we will, anytime throughout the conversation, and we'll be incorporating those then when we get to the Q&A. And for everyone in the room, please be thinking about your questions as we go, and we'll be going back and forth between online and in person. And with that, you are here to listen to them talk, not me, so I will turn things over to Ben and Lauren to get the real conversation started.
Thank you, Amanda. Good morning. It's so great to see everybody here this morning and to be in Baltimore, and it's great to meet you, Ben. I think we could start with just a little bit of background on how we both came to this work in science and policy, and I'm curious what drew you initially to working at the intersection of science and policy.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, big thank you to the... Is this going to work at all?
Is it working? It's really quiet.
Okay.
Can you hear me now? Oh, there we go. Okay. All right. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. Just to start over, I think we could start with talking about how we each came to this intersection of science and policy. What first drew you to this work?
Great. So first of all, big thanks to the Greater Baltimore Climate Summit, to Carrie Harris, to the whole team. For those of you who are tuning in online, you're missing out. This has been an amazingly energizing day. I'll try to channel a little bit of that energy here today. And so for me, I mean, the science policy intersection is a giant place to be. It's a huge space, and we're all there in some place, whether we're scientists, policymakers, or don't define as either, quite frankly. And for me, you know, I squarely believe that all scientists and all people have a role here. Came particularly easy for me because I entered science. You know, we often distinguish between, you know, the basic and applied sciences, or the discovery and the solution sciences. It's really a continuum. But I came into science looking for solutions. You know, it just seemed like one of the tools that we have as human beings to try to make the world better and to, you know, alleviate suffering and improve thriving. And when you enter that way and you start doing work in that space, you pretty quickly figure out that you're not just going to discover your way out of it, right? That you need to be working collaboratively. And when you're working collaboratively, then you find, well, the context really matters. And so you find yourself doing work where you say, wow, you know, there's nothing particularly wrong with the science we're doing, but why isn't it changing things? It's like, well, because there is something wrong with the science we're doing. It's not fully engaged with the policy sphere, with the other context that's going on. And so once you get into that space, I think it just takes its own life. And, you know, I bounced back and forth a bit between doing science and, you know, doing things that are more squarely policy, like working for the State Department on various issues. But in the end, we're all kind of part of that continuum, and it's an exciting place to be.
It absolutely is. Could you speak a bit more specifically about how your current roles, both at Johns Hopkins and with the American Geophysical Union, reflect that bridge between science and policy?
Yeah, sure. And so we got a nice shout out earlier on for the Planetary Health, the Institute for Planetary Health and Planetary Health Alliance at Hopkins. And so I'm involved in that, among other things. And I think one thing that's exciting about doing planetary health in Baltimore that a lot of the people in this room can attest to is that the concept of planetary health is really recognizing these shared global challenges, and recognizes planetary health really places you in local action all the way up. right? And so doing planetary health in Baltimore means really engaging with the environmental justice, with the equity issues we've been discussing this morning. And so there's an opportunity there, I think, to bridge scales through that. As president-elect of the American Geophysical Union, so that's, for those who aren't familiar, that's a large professional society of earth and space scientists that does a lot of work on trying to help bring science into policy and make policymakers aware of the science that can inform their action. And so that's a really nice opportunity for me because one thing that I think any of us in science can attest to is that science is hard, as is policymaking, right? But like it takes a long time to get a little bit done. And meanwhile, there's this world of like fascinating, like amazing stuff going on that you're kind of only indirectly part of. And so being with the AGU and being able to say, wow, let's channel this amazing discovery going on across all the earth space sciences and think about how that can be relevant to society, to people around the world, is really, really a powerful thing to be able to do. So that's been exciting. But enough about me. Lauren, so you start off, I mean, you're a geographer, and you're also an attorney, and you have really moved in that direction. I'm really curious to understand how you've made the decision to kind of take that academic grounding and move into the legal world.
Absolutely, thank you. I grew up on a small farm in the peri-urban fringe of the Twin Cities in Minnesota, and with this deep love for the natural world and a desire to really understand it. And throughout my childhood, watched really interesting land use decisions get made in this kind of developing peri-urban suburban sprawl, and how that suburban sprawl was affecting agricultural land and agricultural production and natural environments that were on the outskirts of the Twin Cities, and really had a desire to understand what was happening. And science is this method of understanding the world around us, and was drawn to studying environmental science and understanding geography to really get into that place-based research about the connections that people have to natural resources and to their environments. And the more that I came to study this interdisciplinary scientific field in geography, I was doing research through Northwestern at McGill, with the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, working in the Peruvian Amazon, looking at adaptation of rural communities and agrarian communities to environmental change and following a river capture event. And saw this framework of these federal programs and local development decisions and regional planning decisions that were shaping what options farmers and communities even had. And wanted to understand better how we shape those programs through policy, because policy is the way that we define a problem and propose a solution to it, or set up a framework in which other people can find new solutions to apply to any development problems that we run into. And found this the greater application for the problems that I was interested in geography and the skills that I was developing as an academic in geography by going through the lens of the law and getting to understand what the tools of the law have to figure out how we write the words on the paper, like the Secretary of Planning was just talking about. How do you write those empowering words in the code that can help create an effective implementation plan that can help with development?
Great, and along the way, you did spend some time on Capitol Hill. I'm really curious how that experience of engaging with the reality of that form of policymaking has influenced your direction.
Absolutely. I got the great privilege to serve for about 3.5 years for the Senate Committee for Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry in DC, working for Chairwoman Debbie Stabenow from Michigan on the Democratic staff for the committee. I got the opportunity to work on legislative drafting, agency oversight at USDA and EPA's Office of Pesticides programs, and processing presidential nominations for conservation, for climate, for tribal issues, for a whole host of issues, and got to work on pieces of legislation like the Inflation Reduction Act, negotiations on the Farm Bill, and really appreciate how incredibly interdisciplinary the process of good democratic policymaking and legislation is. To have so many stakeholders from across the country come in and talk about how diverse the impacts are for an issue like climate. Because a solution that might work, or a proposed national solution that works for the Northeast may not work for the Southwest. So how do you really craft legislative proposals that are flexible enough to be adaptable, but focused enough to be effective, to try and solve these environmental problems, or try and be a catalyst for the types of partnerships that are so inspiring to see at a subnational level. So that, I think a lot about legislation as kind of the I always talked about the Farm Bill as the biggest group writing project in the world, and trying to pull people from all different disciplines, but also as kind of a form of participatory action research, if you will, to better define problems, figure out solutions, and then to solve how to write them. And while, I'm curious for your take, coming from this scientific field, working in the positions that you're in, and engaging with policymakers from a scientific perspective, what are some of the biggest challenges you've encountered in ensuring science meaningfully informs policy and how you communicate science to policymakers?
I just screwed up the handoff, just so you all know. So some of the biggest challenges. So here's what I might want to say about that when we talk about challenges and maybe people talking past each other, like misconceptions that can happen. And so first thing is that I think for scientists or for many of us, we conflate policy and politics, and that can be difficult, right? They're related, but as a result, a lot of scientists I think shy away from the policy sphere, thinking like, oh well, that's politics. I don't do that. It's like, well, no, there's policy that needs to be science informed. And on the flip side, I think that that sometimes there's this professionalization that goes on where policymakers and others in the public turn to scientists as something that's outside of them. Right? There's this science thing going on that then we need to avail ourselves to on this issue. And this is a little bit, I think we've really screwed this up in recent years, and we're paying the price for it now, right? Which is that we've done a lot of availing to authority. That comes from a good instinct sometimes, right? It's the people who really want to make sure that their policy and their personal decisions are informed by the best possible science. But what that's ended up meaning is saying oh, just listen to the science, or the science says this, right? And we've all seen that, what's happened there. And I think that's because, so what we need to do in place of that, I think, is to overcome that challenge, we need to engage in a lot of questioning. And so to have policymakers or others engaged in policy view themselves as scientists. We're all scientists, right? And to really ask questions of the scientists and vice versa. Because if we don't do that, we end up in this situation where you're talking about science as if it's an external authority in which you have no standing. And then if you don't ask those questions, and guess what? You know who's really good at disrespecting authority? Scientists. It's like our job. That's what we do, is disrespect authority and question everything. And I think we've got to this place now where it's oh, there's science, and then there are the bros just asking questions, right? And it's okay, that's not the kind of question maybe we're looking for, right? We're looking for honest questioning, honest dialogue, and I think that maybe if we can do more of that, then we can overcome the challenge of just kind of complete bifurcation that we're starting to see, that again is making our policy political at times when it really shouldn't be. But I'm going to flip that question right back to you, because that's what I was supposed to do in the first place.
I love that framing, because I think that there is often just a disconnect and a mistranslation between scientists and policymakers, because I think that the method of trying to define a problem, come up with a way of understanding it, and propose solutions is actually quite similar between policymakers and scientists. But the way that it actually gets applied and the way that the time frame it happens on are quite different. So that leads to these misconceptions of scientists saying, well, policymakers never listen, and policymakers saying, well, scientists don't understand the constraints we're operating under. The science is inapplicable. And then they just miss each other, when really it could be a question about scale or method, or the scientific methods that can produce a really incredible study that can inform local level action, having really community informed science that can propose specific solutions that are tailored to a specific place, may not be, that same study may not be as accessible or applicable on a national level, where we need to understand how is it replicated across a large number of communities, and what are potential solutions that could be applicable or effective. So I think that it's often about kind of timing, how accessible and timely is the information you're looking for. As somebody on the Hill, we'd have people come in with hundreds, if not thousands, of problems a day via email, meeting in person, hearing from constituents, hearing from other Democratic offices that we served, and we would have a very short time frame to come up with potential solutions sometimes. So knowing who you can call to have that quick question and have that short informative conversation with the scientist to say, hey, you're preeminent in your field, or I know you've thought a lot about this. How would you approach this problem? How would you better inform how I'm supposed to then tell my boss how to approach this when she gets up to give a speech on the floor, for example? Are there
misconceptions that you often hear of, either from scientists about policy or policymakers about science, that you wish more people understood?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that it's again that defining yourself into the space, right? And I think this is a general issue that we're having right now of defining ourselves out of spaces rather than into them. And I think that there's a real opportunity and a real excitement in doing that. And you know, it's easy to say misconceptions like that we can fall back on some sense like, oh, you know, scientists think policymakers don't care about science. Some policymakers think scientists are, you know, arrogant, aloof, everything else that, you know, that we say. But I don't think that's actually necessarily true. I think there's a lot of sophistication, right, going on that people do bridge that pretty well. So some of those misconceptions maybe aren't as damning as we might be told they are. And so I think it's really a matter of being able to engage in constructive ways, right? And I think that there's a lot of opportunity in that space. I mean, you just mentioned something that you were able to call in a scientist, and I think that that's a tremendous opportunity right there, and it speaks to maybe another thing that we want to talk about up here today, which is, you know, are there disconnects, right, in the pacing and the incentives and all these other structures, right? And to me, I feel like the ability to have positions like you occupied, right, where you have scientists fully immersed in policy so they can help be those bridges through these internship and associated programs, is a real way to do that. And I wonder what your thoughts are on some of those, you know, when there's friction in the two systems and how we might overcome that.
I think sometimes a big challenge when you're sitting in one of these legislative roles or these policymaking roles is being able to define not only potential solutions, but how much you don't know yet, and get comfortable with the uncertainty that you're then engaging in a part of. As if you're thinking about the policymaker as a scientist, you're gonna have to make some educated guesses because you need to get something, ideally, get something done. And so having the ability to have cultivated relationships with scientists who could inform, you know, say you get a policy proposal that comes in the door that says, you know, hey, there's 27 million acres of agricultural land held in the conservation reserve, and we've now had the Russia-Ukraine war break out, and we're worried about having enough wheat production. What if we converted that conservation land into wheat production? Being able to turn to agronomists and say, and to the top agronomists in the country and say, hey, could you have your institution do some quick number crunching about whether that is even a feasible proposal? Does that make any sense? If we actually converted that acreage into production, could it meet the promise that we're hearing come in the door? And how should that inform what we think of and as the relative environmental benefit of keeping that land in conservation versus the potential production benefit of transitioning it? And it was only because we were able to get very timely feedback on that we were able to better inform how our chairwoman was able to respond to that kind of a proposal. And sometimes it's also about framing things like the fact that there are big existential questions that we don't have defined yet, and that's where partnerships between, say, Congress and the National Academies are really helpful, where in legislation we can direct the National Academies to do ongoing research on our behalf, as long as we understand how to define the problem from a congressional perspective to say, hey, here's something we really don't know and don't understand, but we would really appreciate it if we could have some long-term research go into this and get some better answers. I'd like to transition from kind of the work we've done to maybe looking ahead a bit. And I'm curious what opportunities you see today for advancing science-informed policymaking at the federal level, in local communities, or through partnerships.
Yeah, I'm going to keep it local because that's the theme, I think, of today, working here in Baltimore. And the opportunity is, like, quite frankly, overwhelming. I mean, there's tremendous opportunity to work, and we all heard this morning from some of the great thought leaders, some of our civil servants here in Baltimore, and our elected officials, all working really in concert, right, to understand how we best advance the well-being of our communities. And science is part of that. And I think there's a great understanding of both the ability and the need to integrate that. So we heard Councilman Mark Conway speaking about, you know, some bills that he'd introduced having to do with cool roofs and the urban heat island. Right? And so, well, why are we doing that? Well, it's lived experience, and also it's been quantified. And I think it's helpful when you hear an elected official quote temperature differentials, right? It's like, okay, that's a win, right? Because now we're talking about using some of the data and some of the understanding we have to try to address some of these environmental injustices. And I think that moving forward, one thing that we've been working on a lot, so I'm part of a project called the Baltimore Social Environmental Collaborative, BSEC, which has been working with a lot of partners around the room and around the city here on how do we best create the science needed for climate resilience and extreme weather resilience and energy security and ending energy poverty in Baltimore. And it's a big mandate. And the unifying theme there is that we're going to do this collaboratively, right? And so if we can co-generate this knowledge, and we're not the first people to say this, but if you can try to do this in as uncomfortable large coalition way as possible. So you've got people in the room together who perhaps don't always get along, right? Who are disagreeing on some of these things. And in Baltimore, there are some disagreements, right? And so, and really embracing that, right? And saying, okay, we're gonna work through this and we're not gonna come out with what the science says, because the science doesn't say anything, right? Science doesn't demand what you do, right? What the science can do is help inform some of your options. And if we iterate in that and say, oh, okay, here are some options, and then hear from some people in the room that say, you wouldn't even think about what matters most to me. It's like, okay, how do we go back? How do we measure that? Why are we talking about urban heat island reduction without talking about violence, right? Things like this. It's like, okay, let's really think about this and let's not look where the street lamp is. Let's look where people tell us we need this as full partners in the enterprise in collecting the data and defining the questions and in choosing which paths make sense for the city. And if you can get the science in there kind of under the hood in this participatory process, then maybe you can go from having these really good targeted environmental bills to mainstreaming in a way in which all of these scientifically informed objectives are thought about holistically in kind of more comprehensive policy approaches, right? So it's always part of the conversation. And honestly, the thing that's exciting about working at the local level is like, we're close. Like, I mean, this is not, sometimes that feels daunting maybe at the national level or if you're going to the quarters of the UN, right? But if you're in Baltimore and you've got these, again, great confluence of elected officials, of community groups, of civil servants who are all really working together through, healthy disagreements sometimes, and want to advance the people of Baltimore with the best available science, there's just so much we can do. You can talk locally, you can talk federal. What do you want to do?
I'll talk about the connection.
The connection, all right, back to you.
I think Baltimore is such a fascinating example. I've so enjoyed being here this morning to hear about the work that's happening here in Baltimore and here in Maryland, because one of the things that really fed my enthusiasm for work at the federal level and work on the Senate committee was being able to look at local examples of really creative coalition building that can also then sometimes translate into national level coalition building. Because, take the Farm Bill, for example. It has everything from supplemental nutrition to conservation programs to commodity supports for large-scale agriculture to organics and specialty crops and international trade. That is not a comfortable coalition. It's going through some dynamic change at the moment. But it is only through that kind of creative coalition building that you can figure out new creative policy solutions as well. And being able to engage with difference and learn from each other gives me so much enthusiasm and so much optimism about what work there is still to be done at the local and the state levels and how that can create new examples of partnerships that can at some point translate back to the federal level as well. As you are going through your work day to day now, what is giving you optimism? And either in your field or in the next generation of scientists and policymakers?
Yeah, it's not a particularly fashionable question these days. So optimism. So the first thing, so I'm going to answer in a couple ways. First is, as a scientist, like we are optimistic. I mean, I will say like science is the most radically optimistic thing that humans do, and I really believe that. And so I think that in that sense, there's always excitement, right? There's idea of what we can discover, what we can learn, how we can make the world better. So that's just built in, right? I think to most people involved in the scientific enterprise. Also at this time, I mean, something that we kind of, it gets so skewed, right, in our national dialogue because we talk about like globalization and competition, and in the United States, like, oh, what's China doing? What's this happening? It's like, yeah, you know what China and India and Indonesia and South America and Africa are doing right now? They are creating scientists, right? Like, oh my God. Like we talk about artificial intelligence with good reason. It's like the kind of natural wisdom and capabilities that are being developed around the world right now is just like so transformative. Right, what a team. So like, I think that's amazing for me as a scientist. So that's what I came into the room ready to say, but if I could add one thing is that, again, for those online, sorry you haven't been here this morning, right? But it's kind of a funny thing to say what makes you optimistic after, you know, being in this room with this group, with this more, like with this army, right? It's like, yeah, I'm optimistic, right? like we got a lot going on. When I say this army, I don't mean like an army for political battle, though there's some that are engaged in that in useful ways. I mean like an army out there to use our collective wisdom and experience together to make this world better for ourselves and our communities. And it's like, I feel like we can do a lot. Yeah. Thank you. So anyhow, I think I'm optimistic, but how about you?
I think it's very similar. I mean, I think that in a year of great disruption for many, and a year of great disruption for many ongoing projects, efforts, and partnerships that are out there, one common through line in this year has been just this incredible energy and a commitment to creativity, to collaboration, to conversation, to figuring out what comes next. I see that in my law practice in DC. I get to work a lot with people who are trying to navigate what is the next step at the Department of Agriculture. You know, how do we adapt to changing federal agencies? How do we figure out how to continue the good work that was being done in a new way moving forward? And that kind of collaboration and the interest from a lot of young people that I hear from. I had the opportunity at the beginning of the month to go back to Northwestern University for my class reunion and talk with a lot of students that are in the Department of Earth and Planetary and Environmental Sciences there. And to hear about the creative synergies that students are finding in their studies to try and pursue their own commitment to climate work is really inspiring to me also, because I think it'll be amazing to see kind of where people take those careers coming forward too. So I think it's time for us to turn to open questions.
Yes, please. Can anyone hear me? Yeah. I'll just talk louder and really hope that it's being picked up by the audio up there. Or I'll try this. No, it's about the same. Okay, well, thank you both so much for that. We do want to make sure that we have a chance for questions in person and online. So I'm going to start with an online question. But then please raise your hand, and we'll work on the shouting with the microphone. Oh, here we go, sorry. Okay, so first question, and there is a little bit of overlap with this one and one that you all had to jump over for time. And so it's about communication styles. So each of the sciences has its own language that's often difficult or even unintelligible for those outside of the field. Can you please discuss how scientists use words to inform, engage, and persuade, quote, outsiders who would then vote on policy?
My work on the Hill made me so incredibly appreciative of effective science communicators and people who could work in both worlds, who could speak the nuance of a scientific field to each other and come to a consensus about an understanding of the current state of the law, but then communicate that in a way that is far more accessible to, I would say, the public, but also myself as somebody who had limited time in a given day to really engage in the depths. I could never be an expert in all of the fields that I was being asked to work in as a committee counsel. So being able to find people who could help me understand and even sit down and just say, okay, can you give me the 101 of what I need to best understand to be able to be effective in this moment and help me help you. And so it's about being able to figure out how to translate between those roles.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to kind of repeat something I might have said earlier, it's like just inviting questions, right? Again, this fear of being wrong in science, or people, especially outside science, approaching scientists is a real problem. And so I think it's incumbent upon the scientists to kind of force people to ask the questions, right? And to have that, and to admit your ignorance, and also for anyone involved in policy to know that they should be asking these questions, right? That in fact the scientists want those questions.
If I could say just one more thing on that point. I often talked about work on the Hill as learning in public. You're often being asked to respond to something in the moment in a meeting, sometimes about a problem you have never heard of before. So having the humility to understand that you don't know everything and know when you can say, hey, I need more information about that. Could you please help me by, when you leave this room, if you could get back to me a few things, or just have folks who could be understanding about the fact that, we as staff, we're also learning. When, you can meet with someone who spent, a decade coming up with the results about a scientific study that they are certain is going to be the answer, and they come in to give it to you to be like, we found the answer, and you're like, well, but it doesn't quite fit with what we currently have set up in the way this system works. Could we try and adapt it together? How can we kind of understand how these two things could work together better? And that has to be kind of a compromising and a conversation.
Thank you. Hi, thanks. This has been a great conversation. And it is reminding me of like how scientists, when you say like 99% of scientists find that climate is changing due to man-made reasons, people in the science field think, okay, that's kind of settled. But in policy or non-scientific communities, it feels like, it leaves the door open. So I'm wondering how do you get that point across that when so many scientists, but not 100, you don't ever get 100%, but how do you say, yes, this is true, even though there's still, some that don't say that?
Yeah, I think that's a huge point, right? That science is never settled, right? And that we're always working on this, but that might be heard in a different way, right? But I think that's where I understand the value of this kind of consensus language and this speaking, and again, appealing to these percentages. But to me, that's part of this appealing to authority that it's not like I knew this in advance, but I think we've all learned it just isn't working, right? And so let's talk to people about what affects them, right? Not whether 99% of scientists think this, but we still have, notwithstanding the fact that's not 99%, we have majorities of people in this country, right, let alone the world, who understand that the climate is changing, right, and who understand that it's human-induced, and are worried about it. It's not the first thing on their mind, right? But it's like, you want to talk to either political party about an issue they're trying to push, they would kill for the majorities we have, right? And so I'm not too concerned about that. There are the merchants of doubt who will try to use that to get inside, right? But then you engage with people about the issues that matter and not necessarily saying, well, do we really know this? It's like, I think enough people feel it now. That I was more worried about that 10 or 15 years ago than I am right now. But.
I think in the world of policy, there is, of all of your options, there is always the option to do nothing. And sometimes it is, people seek out doubt as a way of justifying not doing something. And I'd like to go back to a comment from the previous panel on heat islands that, if you want to see some change, make me do it. And that is the power of coalition, to try and say, hey, we don't care that there's 1% of doubt, but look at all of these people who want to see change that you are representing, and making sure that you're meeting with your representatives, not just for your state, but for your committees. Also, I'm a big believer in meeting with committee and helping them understand how they should be navigating all of the potential tensions across their caucuses. One thing that could be really challenging going through bipartisan negotiations on occasion was, we would have groups that would come in and repeatedly say, hey, we want to see, this is a huge problem for us. We want to see effective work on XYZ climate or sustainability issue. And we would get into a bipartisan negotiation, and our counterparts that we were negotiating with would say, well, nobody's talked to us about that. We haven't heard from anybody about that. And so making sure that there is already an awareness of the scale of the problem, so that you can kind of go over, overcome the doubt to feel certain that you are not going to have a lot of political blowback for actually trying to do something in spite of the fact that there will always be a certain amount of doubt.
There we go. Hi, thank you very much. I'm Laura Bartok. I'm the Coalition Facilitator for Maryland Climate Partners. So really appreciate the conversation about collaboration and coalition work. I'm also interested to hear from each of you and your very different disciplinary expertises to just speak a little bit more about engaging communities in both science research and local decision making. You've talked about the value of that kind of community engagement and engaging diverse perspectives, but I'd love to hear just a little bit more about both the opportunities and the challenges you've seen in engaging communities.
Okay. we got like no time, so it's a great question. I'd love to follow up with you afterwards. But I think that people want to talk about this stuff. So let me just focus on the opportunities. Are there challenges to access different communities? Yes, and we can talk a long time about how that works in Baltimore, right? But I think it is interesting that when you start engaging with people, I'm just to give one quick example. So we're talking about greening, right? A certain neighbor in Baltimore. I will admit I went into this discussion not realizing that street trees make sex workers feel safer, that cultivating vegetation and the right of way gives the unhoused an opportunity to feel ownership of the neighborhood, right? And so these are kind of perspectives that, like, when you do engage, people you didn't go out there looking for will tell you things you didn't know.
Realizing that we are basically out of time, I will keep it short just to say that from a legislative perspective, from a policymaking perspective, I think it's always important to ask who has not found their way to the room yet, and who needs to be brought in, who do you need to go out to connect with? Because if you only rely on the people who already know the way to your table, you're never gonna have a fully informed conversation.
Okay, thank you both so much, and thank you all for your questions. Sorry we didn't get a chance to go through more. I'm just gonna take the quick moderator prerogative and just say in 60 seconds or less, if you had one takeaway for the audience today, in person and online, what would that be?
That there is opportunity out there for new engagement, for creative progress to be made, and that, you know, tap into that energy and that enthusiasm that we all still feel for making change happen, and let that lead the way for you to move through these conversations and kind of find a new path forward.
This is really important and it's really fun, right? I mean, this is a privilege we have in this democracy, so let's do it.
Fantastic. Okay, well, thank you both so much for the informative conversation and for sharing your insights with us all today. And thank you for all the work that you do outside of this. We have the recording will be posted online. We'll have a survey on for those who joined online. We appreciate all of your feedback. And just as a mostly national level organization, we're really thrilled for the chance to engage with our neighbors here in Baltimore for the Greater Baltimore Climate Summit discussions, and hope to have a chance to continue connecting at more local and regional levels with new partners. So thank you again to our hosts for having us, and I think I'm between you and a break. So thanks.